The summer of 1849 was brutal across the Southwest. A survey party of 11 men sent by the U.S. Army Corps of Topographical Engineers had been moving through the high desert of what is now northern New Mexico for 3 weeks. Their mission was to map the terrain, document resources, and assess the viability of the region for American settlement. The assessment, by the 3rd week, was not encouraging. The land was dry in a way that the men from the east had not encountered before. Not the dryness of a drought, not the temporary absence of rain, but a structural dryness built into the landscape itself. The soil was pale and thin. The sky was enormous and cloudless. The rivers they had counted on their older maps had shrunk to thin threads or disappeared entirely into gravel beds that gave no indication that water had ever moved through them at any significant volume. The party's geologist, a man named Samuel Woodhouse, was keeping detailed notes. He was trained to assess land for its productive potential, and his notes from this period are candid in their pessimism. He wrote that the soil composition he was observing was among the least promising he had encountered in his career. Low organic content, high mineral concentration, alkaline in ways that would damage most crops he knew, rainfall patterns that were irregular and insufficient by any standard that Eastern agriculture required. He wrote that he could not imagine how any sustained agricultural community could exist in this landscape. 3 days later, the survey party crested a low ridge and looked down into a river valley where a Pueblo village had been farming continuously for more than 700 years. The fields were green. Woodhouse stood on that ridge for a long time before he wrote anything in his notes. He described, when he finally did write, the physical shock of seeing green in a landscape that his training told him could not support it. Rows of corn standing tall in soil that he had just assessed as non-viable. Squash spreading across ground that should have been too dry and too mineral-heavy for root development. Bean plants climbing structures along field edges in patterns that he could not immediately interpret but that were clearly deliberate and clearly working. He wrote, "I have spent 3 weeks determining that this land cannot grow food. These people have been growing food in it for centuries. One of us is wrong and I am increasingly certain it is not them." That moment, a trained scientist standing at the edge of his own framework, looking at evidence that his framework could not explain, is where this story begins. Because what the Pueblo farmers had developed in that valley was not luck. It was not accident. It was a system of agricultural knowledge so precisely adapted to desert conditions that it produced reliable harvests in an environment where the settlers who would arrive in subsequent decades failed repeatedly, catastrophically, and sometimes fatally. This video is about that system. What it was, how it worked, and why it was so completely invisible to the people who needed to understand it most. To understand why the settlers found Pueblo agriculture so baffling, you need to understand what agriculture meant to them, what assumptions they brought with them into the desert, and why those assumptions made what they were seeing impossible to fit into any framework they possessed. The agricultural knowledge of European and American settlers in the mid-19th century had been developed over generations in environments that shared a set of fundamental characteristics. Adequate and relatively predictable rainfall. Deep, organically rich topsoil built up over centuries of temperate forest or grassland ecology. Growing seasons long enough and warm enough for the crops they knew. Rivers and streams that ran with enough reliability to be counted on for irrigation when rainfall fell short. The entire system of crop selection, soil preparation, planting timing and water management that settlers practiced had been optimized for these conditions. In these conditions the system worked well. Eastern American farming in the 19th century was productive enough to support expanding populations and generate surplus for trade. The settlers who practiced it were not naive or unskilled. They were highly competent practitioners of a system that had been refined over generations to perform in the specific environmental conditions it had been built around. The desert Southwest was not those conditions. The rainfall was not adequate or predictable. It came in 2 seasons, a winter pattern from Pacific systems and a summer monsoon pattern from the Gulf of Mexico, and both were irregular enough that planning around them required a fundamentally different relationship with uncertainty than Eastern farmers had developed. The soil was not deep and organically rich. It was shallow, mineral-heavy, and deficient in the nitrogen and organic matter that Eastern crops required as a baseline. The growing season, while long in terms of frost-free days, was interrupted by heat extremes that Eastern crops could not tolerate. The rivers were unreliable in ways that Eastern rivers were not, running full in spring and early summer and dropping to near nothing by late summer, precisely when crops needed water most. Settlers arrived with seed varieties selected for eastern conditions, soil amendment practices developed for eastern soils, planting calendars calibrated to eastern rainfall patterns, and irrigation assumptions based on eastern river behavior. They planted what they knew how to plant, in the way they knew how to plant it, and waited for results that the environment was not configured to provide. The failures were consistent and severe. Settler farming attempts in the desert Southwest through the 1850s and 1860s produced a historical record of crop failures, abandoned fields, and communities that collapsed when the food supply did not materialize as expected. Some settlers adapted over time, learning from observation and from contact with Pueblo communities. Many did not adapt quickly enough. Meanwhile, the Pueblo villages continued producing. Not always abundantly, desert agriculture in any tradition has bad years, but consistently enough to sustain communities across centuries of climate variation that included droughts severe enough to be recorded in tree ring data as multi-decade events. The system that produced this consistency was not visible to settlers because it did not look like what they understood agriculture to be. It looked, from the outside, like people doing things in the wrong way and getting results that the wrong way should not produce. The first thing Samuel Woodhouse got wrong about the Pueblo fields was the soil. He had assessed the soil of the surrounding landscape and found it non-viable. He was correct about the surrounding landscape. What he had not understood was that the soil in the Pueblo fields was not the soil of the surrounding landscape. It was soil that had been built deliberately and systematically, over generations of amendment and management, into something that the surrounding landscape soil was not. This distinction, between the natural soil of a desert environment and the constructed soil of a long-managed agricultural field, was invisible to Woodhouse because the construction was not dramatic. There was no obvious infrastructure, no machinery, no visible amendment process happening at the moment he observed the fields. The soil looked like soil. He had no way of seeing from observation alone the centuries of organic matter addition, careful composting, and systematic management that had transformed it from the pale, thin substrate of the surrounding desert into something capable of supporting sustained crop production. The Pueblo approach to soil building centered on a practice that modern agronomists call composting but that the Pueblo had been doing for centuries without that name. Organic waste, food scraps, plant material, animal waste, ash from fires, was returned to the fields rather than discarded. Over generations, this continuous addition of organic matter raised the soil's carbon content, improved its water retention, increased its biological activity, and gradually neutralized the alkalinity that made the native desert soil hostile to crops. The transformation was slow. It required generations of consistent practice before its full benefits were apparent. But once established, it was self-reinforcing. More organic matter meant more biological activity, which meant faster decomposition of new organic additions, which meant faster soil improvement. The Pueblo also managed soil compaction with a precision that Woodhouse could not have recognized from observation. Desert soils compact quickly under foot traffic and become impermeable to water infiltration. Rain or irrigation water runs off the surface rather than penetrating to root depth. Pueblo farmers maintain the soil structure in their fields through specific tillage practices that preserve the loose, open texture needed for water penetration while simultaneously preventing the kind of over-tillage that destroys soil structure in dry climates. The balance required was precise and had been developed through generations of observation of what happened when it was wrong. The ash that was added to Pueblo fields was not simply waste disposal. Ash raises soil pH and adds potassium and other minerals in forms that plants can access directly. In soil that was naturally too acidic, which some Pueblo field soils were, despite the generally alkaline character of desert substrates, ash addition corrected the chemistry toward a range where crops performed better. This was not chemistry in the scientific sense. It was the accumulated observation of what happened to plants in fields where ash was added versus fields where it was not, refined over enough generations to become a reliable practice. What Woodhouse saw as desert soil was, in the Pueblo fields, something that had been in construction for 700 years. He was looking at the product of that construction without the historical depth to understand that construction had occurred. Water was the central challenge of Pueblo agriculture, and the Pueblo approach to water management was the element of their system that most consistently baffled outside observers, because it bore almost no resemblance to the irrigation practices that settlers knew and relied on. Eastern irrigation, in the settler tradition, was straightforward in principle. find a reliable water source, build a channel to direct water from that source to the field, apply water to crops at regular intervals. The system required a water source reliable enough to be counted on throughout the growing season. In the desert Southwest, such sources were rare and unreliable. Settlers who attempted to apply Eastern irrigation principles to desert conditions found that the water sources they built their systems around failed at the worst possible times. The Pueblo system was not built around reliable water sources. It was built around the assumption that water sources were unreliable, and it had been optimized to capture and use every possible form of water input, including forms that settlers did not recognize as agricultural resources. The first element was field positioning. Pueblo agricultural fields were not placed in the most convenient locations relative to the village or the labor of getting to them. They were placed in locations where water naturally concentrated. The alluvial fans at the mouths of arroyos, where flash floods deposited both water and nutrient-rich sediment, were prime agricultural locations in the Pueblo system. The floodplain terraces along seasonal streams, where water table depth was shallow enough for deep-rooted crops to access even when surface water was absent. The slopes below rock formations that channeled rainfall runoff in predictable patterns. Every field location was a calculation about where water went when rain fell, not where water was when it was sunny. The second element was water harvesting infrastructure. The Pueblo constructed check dams, small stone barriers across arroyo channels, that slowed flash flood water, spread it across a wider area, and forced it to infiltrate into the soil rather than running off downstream. These structures were small enough to be invisible as infrastructure to someone who did not know what they were looking at. They looked like piles of rocks. They were, in function, water harvesting systems that captured the runoff from a single significant rainfall event and delivered it to fields in a controlled way that maximized infiltration. They also constructed grid gardens, field systems divided by low earthen borders into a grid of small cells, that trapped rainfall on the field surface long enough for it to infiltrate rather than running off. In a rainfall event of half an inch, an open field might retain a fraction of that water. A grid garden retained nearly all of it, distributed evenly across the field surface, because the borders prevented any water from escaping the cell it fell into until the soil had absorbed it. The combination of field positioning and water harvesting infrastructure meant that the Pueblo fields captured and used a far higher percentage of the rainfall that fell in the area than any unmodified field surface would have. In a desert environment where rainfall was the limiting factor for crop production, this efficiency advantage was not marginal. It was the difference between a viable system and a failed one. If there is a single element of Pueblo agriculture that modern agricultural science has most thoroughly confirmed as sophisticated, it is the planting system known as the Three Sisters, the intercropping of corn, beans, and squash in a specific spatial and temporal arrangement that produces outcomes that none of the three crops achieves independently. Settlers observed the Three Sisters system and found it confusing. They were accustomed to monoculture, single crops planted in rows, managed uniformly, harvested together. The Pueblo fields appeared, to settler eyes, to be disorganized. Multiple crops growing together in patterns that did not conform to the row logic of Eastern agriculture. Tall plants shading shorter plants. Sprawling vines apparently competing with standing crops for ground space. It looked like poor farming practice, like fields that had not been properly managed or organized. It was the opposite of poor farming practice. It was one of the most ecologically sophisticated agricultural systems ever developed. Corn provides the vertical structure. It grows tall, creates a microclimate of partial shade beneath its canopy that reduces soil moisture evaporation, and produces a physical support structure for the beans growing beside it. Beans fix nitrogen. This is the element of the system that modern agricultural science finds most remarkable, because nitrogen fixation, the conversion of atmospheric nitrogen into soil-available forms that plants can use, is one of the most valuable processes in agriculture, and the Pueblo had been deliberately utilizing it for centuries before the chemistry behind it was understood. Bean plants host bacteria in their root nodules that perform this conversion. A field that has grown beans has more plant-available nitrogen in its soil at the end of the season than it had at the beginning. In a desert soil where nitrogen was chronically limiting, this input was not a secondary benefit. It was a fundamental component of the system's sustainability. Squash spreads across the ground between the corn and bean plants, covering the soil surface with large leaves that shade the ground, dramatically reducing soil moisture evaporation, suppressing weed growth and protecting soil structure from the impact of rainfall. The squash leaves create a living mulch, a ground cover that performs, through biology, the same functions that mechanical mulching performs in modern agriculture. The three crops together produce a combined yield that exceeds what any of them would produce individually on the same land area. They also produce a nutritional profile that is more complete than any of the three crops provides alone. Corn provides carbohydrates, beans provide protein and the amino acids that corn lacks, squash provides vitamins and minerals. The combination is not just agriculturally efficient. It is nutritionally complete in a way that sustained communities through seasons when dietary diversity was otherwise limited. Woodhouse, standing at the edge of those fields in 1849, saw what looked like agricultural disorder. He was looking at a system of extraordinary ecological intelligence that had been refined over centuries of observation, adjustment, and accumulated understanding of how these three plants interacted with each other, with the soil, and with the specific conditions of the desert environment they were grown in. One of the most important and least visible elements of the Pueblo agricultural system was something that existed before a single seed went into the ground: the seeds themselves. The crop varieties grown in Pueblo fields were not the varieties familiar to Eastern settlers. They were varieties that had been selected, saved, and refined over centuries specifically for performance in desert conditions. The corn grown in Pueblo fields was not simply corn. It was a collection of distinct varieties, each selected for specific characteristics: drought tolerance, heat tolerance, specific maturation timing, particular yield characteristics under low water conditions, that had been developed through generations of deliberate seed selection and saved with a precision that constituted one of the most sophisticated plant breeding programs in the pre-industrial world. Desert corn varieties developed in the Pueblo tradition had root systems that penetrated significantly deeper than Eastern corn varieties, accessing soil moisture at depths where desert soils retained water long after the surface had dried completely. They were selected for the ability to germinate and establish in soil moisture conditions that would have prevented Eastern varieties from germinating at all. They matured in shorter periods, allowing harvest before the late summer heat extremes that could destroy crops planted on Eastern timelines. They had been selected, variety by variety and season by season, for performance under precisely the conditions that made Eastern varieties fail. The bean varieties were similarly specialized. Squash varieties had been selected for drought tolerance and heat resistance that commercial squash varieties of the period could not match. Every crop in the Pueblo system was represented by varieties that were, in the most literal sense, made for the desert, made by generations of farmers who selected seed from the plants that performed best under the worst conditions and discarded seed from plants that performed only adequately under good conditions. This last point is critical and counterintuitive. The Pueblo seed selection process prioritized performance under stress rather than performance under optimal conditions. Eastern agricultural seed selection tended toward the opposite, selecting the largest, most productive plants in good years. In a consistently benign environment, selecting for good year performance makes sense. In a desert, where stress is not exceptional but normal, selecting for stress performance produces varieties that function reliably precisely when reliability matters most. The result was a seed bank of extraordinary depth and specificity, dozens of corn varieties, multiple bean and squash varieties, each adapted to slightly different microconditions within the broader desert environment, each carrying accumulated genetic selection from centuries of farming in that specific landscape. Settlers arrived with Eastern seed varieties and planted them in desert soil. The varieties failed, not because the farmers were incompetent, but because the seeds had not been selected for these conditions. The Pueblo fields produced because the seeds in them had been produced by and for the desert over a time scale that no settler could replicate and no catalog could supply. In the spring of 1851, a U.S. Army officer named James Henry Carleton was traveling through western New Mexico with a small detachment on a survey and assessment mission. Carleton was a careful observer and a meticulous note-keeper, qualities that make his accounts of this period unusually valuable as historical records. Near Acoma, Pueblo, a community that had been continuously inhabited for more than 1,000 years on top of a sandstone mesa rising nearly 400 feet above the surrounding desert, Carleton spent 3 days observing the agricultural fields that the Acoma people maintained on the mesa top and in the valley below. His notes from these 3 days are among the most detailed first-hand accounts of Pueblo agriculture from the period. Carleton arrived with the same assessment framework that Woodhouse had carried 2 years earlier. He was looking at a landscape that his training told him should not be supporting an agricultural community of any size. The mesa top had thin, wind-scoured soil with almost no organic content. The valley below was dry in the way of the broader desert. Rainfall, by his estimate from the vegetation patterns he observed, was barely adequate for the driest forms of grazing and wholly inadequate for crop agriculture by any standard he had been taught. The fields were producing. He spent his 3 days trying to understand how. He watched the irrigation channels that directed water from a small seasonal stream to the lower fields, channels that were more sophisticated than he had expected, with carefully calculated gradients that moved water efficiently over long distances without the scouring and erosion that poorly designed irrigation produced. He examined the check dams in the arroyos above the fields, and unlike Woodhouse, who had missed them entirely, Carleton was attentive enough to recognize them as intentional structures and spend time examining their construction and placement. He observed the planting patterns and noted, without fully understanding the mechanism, that the mixed planting of different crops in the same field appeared to produce less moisture stress in individual plants than he would have expected from the rainfall and irrigation water available. He was observing the microclimate effects of the Three Sisters system, the shade and ground cover reducing evaporation, the combined canopy managing soil moisture, without having the botanical framework to explain what he was seeing. He also observed something that arrested his attention and that he returned to multiple times in his notes: the speed and efficiency with which Acoma farmers moved water through their system in response to a rainfall event. A late afternoon thunderstorm produced perhaps a quarter-inch of rain on the valley floor during his second day there. Within what he estimated as 20 minutes of the storm ending, Acoma farmers were in the fields, opening specific channels, redirecting runoff from specific slopes, managing the movement of water across the field system with a coordination and precision that suggested not improvisation but a practiced, rehearsed response to a known event. They were harvesting the storm. Not watching it fall and hoping it was enough. Actively capturing it, moving it, distributing it through a system that had been designed for exactly this purpose, with the efficiency of people who had done it hundreds of times before. Carleton wrote, "These people do not wait for water. They catch it." Everything described so far, the soil management, the water harvesting, the Three Sisters system, the seed selection, was sophisticated in isolation. What made the Pueblo agricultural system genuinely extraordinary was that these elements were not isolated. They were integrated into a single coherent system whose components supported and reinforced each other in ways that made the whole substantially more effective than any of the parts independently. The soil management made the water harvesting more effective, because soil with high organic content absorbed and retained water far more efficiently than compacted, low-organic desert soil. The water harvesting made the Three Sisters planting more reliable, because consistent soil moisture reduced the stress conditions that could overwhelm even drought-adapted varieties in the worst years. The seed selection made the soil management sustainable because deep-rooted, drought-tolerant varieties access soil moisture at depths that shallow-rooted eastern varieties could not reach, reducing the irrigation demand that the water harvesting system had to supply. Every element strengthened the others. This integration was not accidental. It was the product of a long process of empirical development in which each element had been tested against reality over many generations and refined until it fit precisely with the other elements of the system. A practice that undermined another practice had been eliminated. A practice that enhanced other practices had been preserved and strengthened. The result was a system in which every component had earned its place through demonstrated contribution to the whole. The knowledge that held this system together was carried in the community rather than in any individual. No single Pueblo farmer possessed all of it. The seed knowledge was held by specific keepers whose role in the community was specifically the maintenance and selection of seed varieties. The water management knowledge was held by people whose responsibility was the canal and check dam system. The soil knowledge was distributed across farming families who maintained their specific fields over generations. Knowledge of particular field microconditions, of specific soil behaviors in specific locations, of the timing and quantity of amendment that specific plots required. This distributed knowledge system was more resilient than any individual expertise could be. When a single knowledgeable person died, they took their knowledge with them. When knowledge was distributed across a community, Embedded in roles and practices and physical infrastructure that embodied it, it survived the loss of any individual because it was held collectively. The Pueblo agricultural system had survived droughts, population movements, and centuries of environmental variation precisely because its knowledge was community property rather than individual property. Settlers, by contrast, operated as individual farming families. Knowledge that one family developed stayed with that family. Practices that worked in one location were not systematically shared across the settler community. There was no institutional mechanism for the kind of community-held, role-specific knowledge distribution that the Pueblo system depended on. Each settler family faced the desert essentially alone, with only their individual prior experience and their individual adaptive capacity to draw on. The Pueblo community faced the desert collectively, with centuries of accumulated knowledge distributed across roles and embedded in practices that had been tested against the hardest possible standard. The difference in outcomes was not a surprise. It was the expected result of two fundamentally different relationships between people and the knowledge required to live in a specific place. Beginning in the 20th century, agricultural scientists and ecologists began studying the physical remnants of Pueblo agricultural systems. The check dams, the field systems, the soil profiles of long-farmed Pueblo fields, with modern analytical tools. What they found consistently confirmed what historical observers had documented while simultaneously revealing depths of sophistication that the observers had not had the tools to recognize. Soil analysis of Pueblo agricultural fields that had been in continuous use for centuries showed organic matter content significantly higher than surrounding unfarmed desert soils. Direct physical evidence of the long-term soil building that Woodhouse had not recognized because it was invisible from the surface. The difference in water retention capacity between farmed Pueblo soil and surrounding desert soil was measurable and significant. A rainfall event that produced rapid runoff on surrounding unfarmed ground produced substantial infiltration in the long-managed Pueblo field soil. The fields were not just growing crops. They were functioning as water capture systems in their own right, independent of the formal water harvesting infrastructure. Archaeological analysis of Pueblo check dam systems revealed engineering precision that modern hydrologists found remarkable. The placement of check dams along arroyo systems was not random. It followed gradient calculations that distributed water capture optimally across the agricultural area served by each arroyo. The spacing between dams, the height of the dam structures, the positioning relative to side channels and field access points, all of it reflected a hydraulic understanding of how water moved through that specific terrain that was as sophisticated as any formal engineering analysis would have produced, arrived at through generations of empirical observation and adjustment rather than mathematical calculation. The Three Sisters intercropping system has been studied extensively in modern agroecology and consistently produces findings that confirm its sophistication. Nitrogen levels in Three Sisters fields after harvest are measurably higher than nitrogen levels in monoculture fields growing the same area of corn alone. Soil moisture retention under the combined canopy of the three crops is significantly better than in monoculture corn. Pest and disease pressure is lower in the mixed planting. The diversity of plant species and microenvironments in a Three Sisters field supports a more diverse insect community that provides natural pest control, reducing the vulnerability to single pest crop failures that monoculture systems are susceptible to. The Pueblo seed varieties that survived into the modern period, preserved through the efforts of specific Pueblo communities who maintained their traditional seed practices through the pressures of the 20th century, have been analyzed by plant geneticists and found to contain drought and heat tolerance traits that modern commercial breeding programs have spent decades trying to develop in major crop species. The deep root architecture of traditional Pueblo corn varieties allows access to soil moisture at depths that commercial varieties cannot reach. The early maturation timing allows harvest before heat extremes that destroy later maturing varieties. These are not primitive characteristics. They are sophisticated adaptations that took centuries to develop and that modern agricultural science is actively trying to understand and replicate. Samuel Woodhouse left the Southwest in 1850 and returned to a medical and natural history career in the East. He published accounts of his survey travels that were read by other scientists and contributed to the growing body of knowledge about the natural history of the American West. In those accounts, he returned to the moment on the ridge above the Pueblo fields, the moment when he had stood and looked down at green crops growing in soil he had assessed as incapable of supporting them. He described it carefully, with the precision of a trained scientist, and he was honest about what it had done to his framework. He did not pretend that he had immediately understood what he was seeing. He wrote that the adjustment required was not quick or easy, that the sight of those fields had not produced immediate insight but had instead produced a long period of unsettled uncertainty, a feeling that something fundamental in his framework was wrong without yet knowing what it was or how to correct it. He never fully answered the question. He did not have the tools, the soil science, the botanical understanding, the hydrology, to reconstruct from observation alone what the Pueblo system was doing and why it worked. What he had was honesty, and that honesty produced something valuable in his account. He did not explain away what he had seen. He did not retrofit the evidence to his prior conclusions. He wrote that the fields were producing in soil that should not support them, and he left that statement standing as a problem he had not solved. The problem has since been solved, not by dismissing his assessment of the surrounding soil, which was accurate, but by understanding what the Pueblo had done to the soil in their fields over 7 centuries of management. The soil was different. The seeds were different. The water management was different. The planting system was different. Every component of the agricultural system the Pueblo used had been built, refined, and integrated over a timescale that no individual observer arriving with a different framework could reconstruct from 3 days of observation. What Woodhouse was looking at was not a miracle. It was not luck or accident or the mysterious productivity of a particular patch of ground. It was the visible result of centuries of accumulated, tested, community-held knowledge applied to a specific environment with the precision that only a very long relationship between a people and a place can produce. The settlers who followed Woodhouse into the desert southwest arrived with good tools, good intentions, and genuine competence in the agricultural system they knew. What they did not have was time. Not the time of a season or a decade or a generation, the time of centuries. The time it takes to learn a desert well enough to feed a community from it reliably year after year, through the droughts and the heat extremes and the soil that gives nothing easily. The Pueblo had that time. They had used it. And the green fields that appeared impossible in pale desert soil were simply what that time, applied with care and intelligence and community, eventually looks like. If something in this story stayed with you, the fields that should not have been green, the storm that was harvested rather than waited out, the seeds selected for the worst years rather than the best ones, or the scientist who stood on a ridge and admitted that something in his framework was wrong, leave it below. This is the kind of history that deserves to be remembered.